I guess the most common mistake I see and hear from producers who are just starting out would be to try and create a track in a specific genre. And I think it's fun sometimes to just go in the studio with the idea that you're going to make some music rather than, okay, I really like this track and I'm going to try and replicate it. Because then you're only really learning a very narrow range of skills that somebody else has done, and your approach to music making might be completely different, and you might find that that doesn't suit you. So I always kind of advise to make genreless tracks. Just go in with no fixed idea, make some music, and then you'll find your own techniques and your way of doing things. And then perhaps you'll be able to more effectively create the sounds that you hear and love from other people. Definitely the most common complaint I hear from people who struggle with productions, especially when they're starting out, is that they have a few elements, like a few loops that they really like, but then when it comes to fitting them and completing a track, it's impossible. So they generally have a lot of ideas and they become very frustrated because they think that they can do music because they've proved it by coming up with these little loops and stuff, but getting the finished track together is beyond them. And I think what's going on here is a decision-making problem. I didn't learn this fully myself until I worked with traditional bands, actually, and that's where, even though I'm a mainly electronic music producer, I learnt the most from working with producing a proper band with acoustic instruments and session players, because then in that environment, when you're up against the clock in the studio, you have to make decisions very quickly. You can't ask a seasoned session player who is on big money and you're on the clock to do 100 takes just because you say, well, what if he does another great fill that I can use, So you have to make decisions early, and as a producer, I think one of the strongest skills you need to have is being able to envision what your track's going to sound like at the end. And you need to do that fairly early on in the track rather than leave everything open-ended, because you can always find that other sound. You can always change that preset at any moment. You can go on endlessly, but you will never ever finish anything. So commit to audio early if you've got MIDI plugins, and choose takes early if you're working with other musicians, and basically get your decision making down very early. The ideal plugin for me would be one that emulates old equipment that you can't get. And I've actually been on at some software developers because, okay, we see all these great Neve emulations, API, I could go on and on. They've done pretty much, like the Pultec. Everyone's got their own kind of variations, and it just becomes a case of who's emulated it best, and often the hardware units will sound as different as the different plugins. So I generally try not to get into those emulations. What I want is emulations of EQs that are incredibly hard to find, and I have been on at a few of them to get hold of like the early German, like Klein and Hummel and Siemens, and some of those EQs that are still very sought after, but you won't find them in every studio in the world. You can find an 1176 compressor in pretty much any studio in the world. So I don't understand really why they haven't gone there. Some of them have started to do it with consoles. The Red console with Waves, for example, and Helios with UAD and Waves. So there's been a few, the big sort of ticket consoles from the 70s, but I'd like to see them go back and get a few more esoteric EQs. My ideal plugin would be one that just encompasses like a vintage collection of very rare EQs, I guess, and compressors. I don't have any fixed methodology when I go in the studio to make a track. Sometimes I'll start with something as basic as a 4/4 kick drum, and then I'll just try and create polyrhythms with Native Instruments machine, and start a track from there. Other times, like I did for my producer sessions, I will choose a break beat and chop up a break and get some kind of rhythm going from there. Or I'll just start with a sequence from my modular synthesizer, you know, and not have any drums at all, and then add drums at a later point. And I think that's been one of the keys to me not being ever within a fixed genre, is that I don't have a methodology. I don't even have a sample library of my favourite sounds. I don't keep any of the sounds. I don't duplicate the same kick in any track. I literally start from scratch from each track, and I keep the parts backed up in case of a remix or, you know, a sync and they need a slightly different edited version or something. But I never reach back to those tracks and use the same parts. I find that I'm not the kind of producer who hits on a formula and then keeps at it. For me, and don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing myself in any way, but the artists I like, personally, like Miles Davis, for example, they were constantly searching as an artist to challenge themselves with new kind of sounds and incorporating, in the way that I incorporate new technology, whether that be hardware or software. He would incorporate new band members, you know, and they'd each bring a different kind of feel to his band and his music at that time. And I guess that's what I try and do in my own humble way, is try and keep the interest from a creative point of view going by having that kind of open-endedness as far as my methodology goes. My favourite track by another artist, I was asked this recently. I was put on the spot on BBC Six Music, so I'm going to give you the same answer. It's and the reason I chose it is because it's a universal track that I think you can play in any kind of club environment or home environment. It's Expansions by Lonnie Liston Smith, which came out in 1975, and it just seems to have this universal appeal. I haven't even sort of hardcore techno fans who would shy away from kind of jazz chords and stuff. They love it because it's got like a repetitive kind of techno-ish bass line, and then it's got these kind of phased hi-hats and a phased Fender Rhodes, and it's a very modern sounding track, but it's also a very spiritual, deep and uplifting track, but with a dark kind of harmony behind it. So I think it's the ultimate track. It's my favourite track of all time, and that's the track I most wish I would have, could have come up with something like that. The best piece of production advice I've ever had is to monitor at the lowest level you can, and then increase the volume at certain key points, especially if you're working with club tracks. If you want to feel the track, then do it at the last possible moment, but while you're mixing, keep it as low as possible. And I have worked with some engineers who have mentioned other producers who very well-known famous producers who've sold millions and won Grammys, and they monitor at whisper volume. And the concept behind that is to get the mix as clear, pristine, and as slamming as possible at that kind of volume. And then obviously when you raise it up, it's just going to sound immense. So and it works for me. It really works. And also it saves on ear fatigue. You don't end up whacking on loads of high frequencies because your ears are dulled. And I only really master very loud at the end when I want to feel the energy of the track. These days, the line between being a DJ and a producer are so blurred that I think the general public probably wouldn't know the difference between the two. I don't see it as a good thing or a bad thing. I just think it's it's the evolution of dance music. And I don't think it's changed that much, actually, when you think about it, because my favourite DJ of all time is Larry Levan. And when he was alive, you know, he would do so many remixes, but he would also play at Paradise Garage, you know. So already he was someone, is he a DJ or is he a producer, is he a remixer? And the same goes for a lot of my DJ heroes, Shep Pettibone or T. Scott or Walter Gibbons, all famous New York DJs who also did most of the popular remixes around at that time. Francois Kevorkian, another example, who's still going strong today. So I don't think things have changed that much, and I think there's still that kind of blurred line, and I think if you're just a creative DJ, you'd want to get involved and you'd know how best to kind of remix a track to work for the dance floor. Who else would know better? I don't think the wealth of software plugins in music production these days has made things easier, because there's so much choice. So it's almost made it harder in a way. When I started out, there wasn't much choice. This is 1990. I purchased my first musical equipment. It was basically, you bought a mixer, a sampler and some keyboards and mixed it onto a reel-to-reel, or a DAT machines had just come out then. Whereas today, where would you start? You know, you could just get some software like Ableton Live or Logic, and that's got enough in it, you know, that would completely confuse someone like me who started in 1990. That would be a kind of overload. And that's one thing I again, when people ask me for advice when they're starting out, is to not buy much equipment, not buy hundreds of plugins, because you're just gonna not going to be able to master any of them. Just choose a few, select. Today I would just have Ableton Live and Native Instruments Machine. You know, if I was a budding producer, you can do everything with those. You know, just 2 bits of kit. The very first step I would, after you've bought your equipment, would be to learn some basic music theory. And this is the step that is missed by, I would think, the majority of young producers. They immediately leap into watching lots of tutorial videos about how to make the beats, how to make the sounds, and then they'll put them together and you'll hear a demo online on SoundCloud or whatever, and the bass line will be completely out of tune with the chords or the arpeggio, and they'll kind of know something's not right, but because they if they're not musically trained, they don't really know that process. And I think that is the next stage. You know, learn about having things in the right key. I'm not a musician, I'm not trained at all, but I do think it helps to at least know if your bass line's out of tune or not. And I have had disagreements with people about this, but they say, well, that's the kind of quaint thing about a lot of early techno in the late 80s, is it's a bit out of tune. I didn't like those tracks then, and I don't now. They sound amateurish, and I don't see why it should be looked as amateurish. This is incredibly sort of state-of-the-art music. Will have the musical theory state of the art as well as the sound design. The best BPM. Just finish there, I think, of me going.
That works. Good.